Yeah, you mentioned your voice, and you're very, very self-critical, aren't you, Karin? Because I tell you, if there's one thing that everybody who I've spoken to who has listened to any of the podcasts, and they normally stop in by listening to your podcast, they all say how fabulous your voice is. And so it's funny to me whenever I hear you be critical of your own voice, because I
I
know
had
that everybody
I had
loves
a
your
very,
voice.
very clear voice, and I had speech training from day one when I was 14, 15. Then we had speech training when we were in translators and interpreter school. In America, I had to speak absolute perfect German, no inkling of Rhinish accent, whatever. So I'm very conscious of my voice. Yes, that's true.
Mm. But you still have a fabulous voice, and that's also true, even if you are so
I hear it
critical.
in a different way. That's different.
Yes, yeah. Do you know, I am. I'm like that too. I'm not sure I necessarily appreciate my own voice. However, what I decided to do some time ago was just to ignore it. It's my voice. If other people say it's okay, then that's cool. And if they say it's not okay, there's not much I can do about it. It's my voice.
Right,
So,
right.
um, you know.
That's the blessing of old age. You accept things, which I was very late in accepting certain things. Yes, that's true.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting though, because sometimes the most different of people come to similar conclusions at completely different times, and it does make you wonder really if everybody to an extent comes to a similar conclusion, then why can't we just cut to the chase and teach people make it part of the educational system that at some point you are going to all agree. So let's forget all the trouble and just agree that some things are okay. And if we learn a
Yes.
bit of harmony, it's okay, isn't it?
Tolerance is something you can learn. Yes, even tolerance to yourself.
Mm. Which is sometimes the most difficult in a sort of free market style system where we are taught the value of competition, and sometimes the competition is our own selves, and that makes it quite difficult because you can never win.
That's true. I'm not competitive. I never was. When I was playing tennis against my friends, I didn't care whether I won or lost. So I let them win most of the time. No, I was didn't do it on purpose, but I stepped back 2 steps. In terms of everything else I've done, the only thing that really pushed me on was a certain type of self-criticism with a terrible amount of perfectionism. I wanted everything perfect. So I tried very, very hard. And that's why I could swim in America. Because that's at the time there was no competition, but it was very necessary that all of us pulled together. And later, when that's the period we are coming into, from about 1999, the next 10 years were pretty heavy in terms of the different things I was doing. And I will later list them just one after the other, and then you tell me what you want to hear about. Because it was a tremendous amount, and it really got me to my limits. But it was fun anyway, and I'm very happy I did it.
Could we not do all of them? Because there really is no rush. There's no rush. Yeah. If it takes 3, 4, 5 podcasts to do these next 10 years, I'd be happy to take as many sessions as is needed. It's just, it's up to you. The speed with which you wish to communicate these experiences. It's completely.
I'll let you decide. But what I thought I would do is give us just a brief preview of all the different things that happened in the next years.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, if you mention what you think, then
And then you can step in.
Okay. Yeah. We'll just. I mean, I will consider this as already having begun, and so therefore I will just have to do a little bit of editing earlier to just at the beginning to remove my silly introduction. But then please feel free to enlighten me as to which topics you want to or you think are most important.
Well, since the next step is the active pen work, I can start with when I moved from a German-speaking Writers Abroad Pen Center and was invited to join German Pen because I was living in Germany. I started to help with their Writers in Prison work. I was invited to their conferences as a member of German-speaking Writers Abroad, and it was, I thought, time to make a choice and step into Germany, not just physically. So I became a member of German Pen in 97, and 2 years later, there were all kinds of preparations for a new election, and we had a president who was the first non-German writer ever as president of German Pen. And I felt, because he was very good and he was a lovely poet and a good friend, and I decided I step into his shoes as Writers in Prison committee member or vice president if they vote me in, because he was at that point running for president. So in a way, that was the first initiation into Writers in Prison, into active work for a pen center. Writers in Prison as such is a committee that you have to enter. It's a committee that is organized through International Pen in London. You have to enter the committee and join in the work, but you don't have to as a pen center. The pen centers are free to choose their own committees or their own type of work. They're autonomous. And German Pen was very, very active in Writers in Prison and later also in Writers in Exile. Writers in Exile was not a committee, it was a network, but all the other committees German Pen was not very active in and was not very interested in. German Pen started in 1997. In 2000, I was voted in as vice president for Writers in Prison, which I stayed for 7 years until 2007. Mm. Almost immediately, I was also chosen to become member of the board of the Heinrich Böll House in Düren, which was the house where Heinrich Böll had lived and died, and which had been organized into a artists' refuge. So we had scholarships for half a year, 4 months, for some 4 or 5 individuals or families. And this came very well into my work for Writers in Exile for German Pen, and later also for International Pen. So the Böll House involvement came in 2001, and it stayed for some 18 years. I only stepped out recently. The during that time, for the Heinrich Böll House in 2002 and 2004, I organized poetry matinees with international guests from all over. The organization was together with a friend from Holland, and we had 2 wonderful events, except in terms of price, effort, and results. It wasn't enough for the people who were giving the money, so they stopped it, although it had international acclaim, actually. That came also with being on the board in 2001 to 2004 of the jury in the Künstlerdorf Schöppingen, which is an artists' organization with some 23 or even more scholarships recipients every year, writers and painters and musicians, half of them from Germany, half of them from foreign countries. That was a very interesting experience. And then came the work that was basically going on alongside. But the work for German Pen was the one at the base. I was doing everything. I was more on the phone with the Foreign Office or with embassies where our charges had been molested or were thrown into prison. It was really networking on an official basis, networking on an unofficial basis, building your own committee with your friends. And I had a lot of international friends. So I had a lot of insight and input into my understanding of what was going on in the world. And that was very important because in the first years, I was for German Pen in 5 subcommittees of Writers in Prison, which was Mexico, China, Africa, Turkey, and Iran. And that was heavy because in Iran and in Turkey, there were more people in prison than anywhere else. Later, China caught up, and Turkey changed its methods and kept them hanging. They were not thrown into prison. Their trials were postponed and postponed and postponed to really have an effect on the society, on their colleagues, and on those who were in front of the jury. Not the jury, in front of the court. This I got firsthand when I was in Turkey during the trial of Orhan Pamuk. There was an evening before when one of our activists not our activists, he was one of the major activists in Turkey, had invited everyone who was waiting for their trial. And there were almost 40 people, from lawyers to judges to writers to whatever. That was the night before the trial of Orhan Pamuk. The trial could have been scary. As I said, I don't scare easily. On the other side of the street were rows and rows of rightists, Turks, from the Grey Wolves to other groups, to Kemalists and whatever. And they were trying to threaten us, and we weren't quite sure whether not one of them would pick up a gun and shoot him. So we were in a group of some 50 observers, most of them from international pen centers, and they even dared to touch one of the English members of parliament, which to us was a sign it can really get bad. The trial in itself was strange because there was a group of some 15, 20 lawyers who were violently against freedom of the press and freedom of writing, and they were actively threatening the important writers who were there also. Yasha Kemal was there, and he was being threatened, and he was pushing against it. He was very vocal, which allowed me to understand that the opposition in Turkey was at that time very, very strong. And but it needed to be strong because the pressure from the government was very strong. During those years, just before, I had met a number of Nigerian authors in the line of organizing that anthology for Holman Verlag. And one of them had called me from England and had said, I'm going back to Nigeria. And I said, if anything happens, call me. We'll do anything we can to get you out whatever trouble you are in. 6 days later, we heard that he had been imprisoned, and we didn't know whether he was being tortured, whether he had enough food, whether we were frantic. So in a way, we organized in Germany contact to the Goethe House. Since I'd also been part of the Goethe House at one point, I knew the system, and I got in touch with the person in Nigeria from the Goethe House. And she was lovely. She knew him very well. And we were able to get some money to her for her to bribe the guardsman and get the information we wanted and get him what he needed, like soap and hygiene stuff. And he came out later after 6 months. And we saw him again when he came to Germany for a scholarship in Stuttgart, at which point, again, I was called, Karin, can you please do a book for me, because they give me the chance to have a German translation of my work. So within, I think, 8 months, I translated a book of poetry. Poetry I loved, and it was published, and he was happy, and we had been in touch for a long time until he was in America, and then he was in Nigeria again, and so on and so forth. So all these things come together when you get into a situation where you cannot help. I had met Anna Politkovskaya quite a number of times. She had gotten the German pen Hermann Kästen Award, or medal and prize, and during that time she was already under pressure, and I had approached her and had said, when and if you need help, we always have some way through International Pen or German Pen to get you a place to hide or to survive in exile. And she didn't want any of that. She went back, and it didn't take very long. And when was it? It was in 2006, in October, that she was murdered in front of her house in Moscow. We were devastated. And just over half a year later, we were twice as devastated because a good friend we had met, and we're dealings with doing many instances, particularly our director of Writers in Prison in London. had very close contact with him, and I had met him at the book fair and at the Pamuk event as one of the nicest and warmest people I ever met. And he was killed on 19th of June, 2007. You cannot...
Sorry, can I say, so Anna Politkovskaya was related to her work for the war in Chechnya,
In Chechnya, and for her work with her paper and her anti-Putinism, yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah.
I was able to convince German PEN a year after his death that the next PEN Award, the Kästen Medal and Prize, would be given to Argos, the newspaper that Rantig had managed, and his wife came to Germany to pick up the prize. I wasn't able to go. This was for one reason or another. I was not available, so I never met her. But I have very fond memories of both Anna and Rantig. And those are the moments that you really would like to have missed in the work for PEN.
You mentioned before your interactions with Hrant Dink. So I mean, he was actually an individual who you met a couple of times, I think. So you have it wasn't just simply a sort of distant pen pal style relationship where you communicated to people over long distances. Sometimes you met them personally. You engaged.
Yes. I met him a couple of times in person because our PEN work, Writers in Prison, was centered in London, and the office of the Writers in Prison Committee was in London. So there was a manager, a director, Sarah Wyatt. She was fantastic. She had come from Amnesty and later worked for PEN for 20 years. And I think she's still one of the people they consult on things Turkish and so on. She was the one who had the contact from the beginning. I met Rand through her at the book fair when we had a long talk, because the International PEN had known that he was in danger and had lots of contacts with him. Particularly Sarah had very much contact with everybody in Turkey. She was in Turkey all the time. And then I met Ranting again after the trial against Orhan Pamuk. Pamuk was given a reception on the next night. And this is when we had a longer talk, when I talked to Ranting for quite some time. And he was kind enough, because he saw I was kind of lost. I didn't speak the language, and I knew only a couple of people, or only those who came from the outside. And he was kind enough to guide me around and introduce me, and we talked a lot. And as I said, he was one of the warmest and friendliest people I ever met.
Yeah, I mean, there was an anniversary event organized in Berlin some years ago, before Corona times. And I went to see Can Dündar talk about his good friend Hrant Dink. And he said that it was a big loss to not only to Turkey, but also to the journalistic world, because he was a very hopeful person, and he believed that there could only ever be a solution through dialogue, through understanding.
Right.
Which
for a non-violent person to die a violent death is more than a crime.
Yeah.
We had quite a number of, Cologne had quite a number of memorials to Hrant Dink over several years, and one of my friends was involved. I was at that point so busy I was not available either. So I know that Cologne had quite a number of evenings of memories of hunting and of appreciation of his life.
But all of this work that's being conducted by your colleagues at Penn and yourself, of course, as well, the government in Turkey. So at the moment, everybody is looking at what's happening in Turkey under Erdogan, and obviously Erdogan has a particular reputation in international politics, but I mean, what you're referring to is an issue which not only existed at the turn of the millennium, but it has existed for many years. And is this like a sort of constant struggle between the different powers? You've got on the one hand the right wing, the very nationalistic support for a strong conservative Turkish government. And on the other hand, you've got the reformists, or perhaps even the Gulenists. I mean, where is this? Why are Turkish political issues so difficult to resolve? Why do elements from within Turkey feel they need such a strong hand?
I personally don't know anybody who would support Erdogan. I don't know anybody who would support the military government that was preceding his dictatorship. Let's call it that. Even Erdogan had different times. When I started in Writers in Prison and got involved in Turkey, we had hopes that after a revamping of the criminal code, certain paragraphs would never reappear under Erdogan. That the courts and the parliament would erase the insult laws. The insult laws were insult to the flag, insult to Kemal Atatürk, insult to Turkishdom, whatever that is. So they could be imprisoned for years and years and years if they were simply called or considered to have insulted something. When the criminal code had been revised, these clauses reappeared in different spots. And it was after that Erdogan became very openly dictatorial, Islamist, and unbearable and dangerous.
Yeah, and unfortunately, this has continued to the present day, and he remains a thorn, I think, to the ideas that the EU had for Turkey, I think, some time ago, but that seems to have passed anyway, and there doesn't seem to be any change on the horizon. But it's interesting, isn't it?
There's a strong element still there in Turkey who resists the regime of Erdogan, and they're working against, or they're working for change. And I know that International PEN has not stopped supporting those who are in trouble by fighting against Erdogan.
But unfortunately, I suppose whenever these people reach a certain stage, then he always introduces this sort of fake coup style scenario, which allows him to arrest all of the troublemakers or people that he perceives as being troublemakers. Because I can't imagine that the coup was unknown to him when it happened. I can't remember when it was exactly, but a few years ago. It just seems,
yeah,
it just seemed too convenient for his policies.
There's something I learned when I worked for PEN and got involved in learning about so many different societies, so many different periods in history where the same thing happens. These methods, these mechanisms are not new. They will not ever go away. The only thing we can do is try to contain them, because to divide a country is very, very good for those in power. To suppress, if you have people who follow you, I know it from knowing about German history. There were people, of course, who were not Nazi, but there were too few who fought it. We all can understand why some of them didn't, because their families would have been killed. They would have not had a chance to really join up, but it was the lack of resistance. And to me, resistance against that kind of, you can almost call it theocracy in terms of Erdogan, because he thinks he's God in Turkey.
Like a sultan of some sort.
Yes. So, I mean, he's the civil and the divine order. And again, that resistance has to be taught and has to be learned. And I hope that in Germany or in Europe, through the First and the Second World War, where my country was always on the wrong side, that we all have learned that resistance is a must, that you have to teach kids to resist, to say no.
But it's a strange concept, isn't it, in many ways, because you're essentially inspiring the revolutionary element within your future generations. So, I mean, I completely agree with what you're saying.
It's not revolutionary. It's just protective, self-protective.
But then this is what the people who defend the Second Amendment in the USA keep saying. The right to bear arms is for them protected because of that fundamental purpose. And I'm against the Second Amendment because I think that there's no need for everybody to be armed.
No, to be armed and to say no are two widely different things. I don't mean in the saying no. A child who says no when somebody comes and wants to touch him or her has to be taught that they have the freedom to do, that they don't have to give kisses to every adult who comes close. Mm-hmm. And this is the no I would like to have instilled in the society, that you can say no to any movement or any direction that you think is wrong. That's part of democracy.
Sure.
Whereas the Second Amendment, to me, is not part of democracy, but it is of violent reaction against other people. I've lived long enough in America, and I had weapons in the house, and my brother-in-law went with a gun to work for a liquor store in Kentucky. All these things I couldn't understand, and I know there are quite a number of people in America who don't understand it either.
Yeah.
That's part of the division in America, which has been kindled over generations now.
Yeah, it's hard to remove that. I mean, the Second Amendment for many people it's the most important amendment, unfortunately, and it's practically the same for Democrats and Republicans. You can't even split it that way. I mean, at the moment, Democrats are more inclined towards control of guns and the disbursement, as it were. But there are still lots and lots of Democrats who are also armed.
That depends on which way you look. If you know you don't have a chance to erase the Second Amendment, you try to control it. And this is what the Democrats are trying to do. I know that many Democrats are against the Second Amendment, and there are more and more voices saying we need to change the Constitution.
Mm. It's interesting because you also from our discussions you said that you were in the USA from 1960, and you were there when Kennedy was elected, and essentially it was Kennedy who moved the Democrats more to the center, as it were, of politics. Before then they were also I can only imagine as being a bit more right wing. And so it must be interesting for you as well to see this shift, because at the moment the Democrats paint themselves as the party of liberal politics, but they were not always that.
Life changes, politics change. In America, the parties have switched roles. The Democrats during the time of the Civil War, the Southern Democrats were pro-slavery. The Northern few Democrats were against slavery. It was the Republicans who were against slavery. So after the war, after Reconstruction, the roles switched. The Democrats became more aware of democratic rules and social responsibility, particularly then in the Second World War with FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But on the other hand, the Republicans turned right, and the Republicans took over in the South from the old Democrats who had been devastated, of course, because their slaves had gone. They didn't have the power anymore. And so the Republicans took over. And all of a sudden, the Republicans were the rightist force, and the Democrats were never were really the leftist cause. There was a Labour Party, which never really had the power to do anything. But it still exists. It still exists. International politics are constant changes. The methods pretty much stay the same, but the alliances change.
Yeah, and I guess you also saw this directly through your work, because you had to operate with a lot of these countries, as you mentioned the list earlier, so Turkey and Iran and among others. Perhaps not easy to communicate with these countries. How was it for you as a woman? Because recently there's been a bit of controversy with how Erdogan treated Ursula von der Leyen. How were you treated by these more liberal thinkers as a woman when you went to these countries?
I was working from Western countries. I was working into the countries where the perpetrators were. I was never in Iran. The Iranians I knew were here. They were our contacts to their friends in Iran. The other contact was through the German embassy in Iran. So my direct contact was never with right-wing Iranians. So I knew that their way of dealing with women, because we had quite a number of women refugees. But I never had any personal involvement in that, and no personal experience with that question. And this is what happened in many ways. I was still the outsider. I had ways of getting in and getting information out, but I had none of us had the power to go in and change anything. we had to rely on the fact that public pressure, economic pressure, political pressure, and the circumstances themselves caused a change of idea and a change of methods in these countries. Whenever a PEN member or anybody says, "Oh, we got him out of prison," I get furious, because that's impossible. You need help. You need mass of people. You need publicity. You need the politics. You need, particularly in modern times, of course, the economic angle to have any effect in any one of the countries. I'm speaking of China or Iran or Vietnam or whatever. And Turkey, of course, is in that group. It's a different way of looking at my work. I'm not doing any work. We are doing the work, and we need the luck of changes in the countries.
And so what PEN does, I guess, with its writer network, is to draw attention to these issues through literature, through poetry, through culture. Essentially, these are the main four or arms, as it were, at your disposal.
First of all, the research in those countries, or in many countries, we have some 170-something PEN centers in the world. Not all of them national centers. There are some exile centers. But so we're represented in, let's say, 150 nations. So through our members, we get the most direct information of what is happening where they are, whether they need help, whether their friends need help. And this is how we get the information out of those countries. We get our information into those countries, of course, through our members, but that doesn't help anything. We need public support. We need the press. We need the rapid actions. Rapid actions is one of the major means for writers in prison, and Amnesty has something similar. Lightning actions, I think, is what they call it. That is when there's something urgent. The news goes out to all PEN members and all PEN centers, to the writers in prison committees, to international agencies. We are, International PEN is a consultant to UNESCO and the United Nations in terms of human rights. All this information goes out to wherever people work and live who can help and who can activate their press or write letters to their representatives and to their embassies, so to speak. That's one of the major methods of fighting repression, because that's what they respond to sometimes.
When we watch movies, then there's always this thing about reputation, as in when, for example, a plot line doesn't really come across as too convincing, and the baddie can't be convinced to do this or that or be killed or whatever. They always bring on this thing, but the baddie doesn't want his or her international reputation to be damaged, and so therefore they're more likely to listen. How important do you think international reputation actually is in influencing domestic policy?
It varies. It varies because certain things have to come together. An economic interest, a political interest, and maybe a personal interest must come together, that a perpetrator country or their representatives have a change of mind. This is not something that you can say This is what I meant. You cannot say we did this or this method got them to change their mind. A lot of things have to come together, particularly in the countries themselves.
Mm. Yeah. And I mean, because often we hear democratic representatives say when talking about other countries, it's not for us to comment. That's a domestic issue. And yet the
That's an
democratic leaders have.
international convention,
Mm.
and it's a safety net for politics at home.
Okay, but it still happens. As in, for example, Obama commented on Brexit. I believe, or was it Obama? Yeah, Obama, I believe, commented on Brexit. Trump commented on Brexit quite famously. Biden has suggested that he's very pro EU with regards to his stance towards Brexit. And vice versa, as in politicians in the UK were also quite vocal in their support of Trump. We're talking at least people like Nigel Farage. We're talking about conservatives here. Others were more circumspect in saying, we don't want to get involved. But I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, obviously leader of the Labour Party, he was also very vocal in his criticism of Trump. So this maxim that we don't get involved in the politics of other countries is a falsehood. It's a defense mechanism.
It's also who is speaking. If it's a line of politics or policy, the head of departments still say what they want. It's the people who are bound by the civil servants end of politics. They are bound by we cannot interfere with other countries. Everybody else does if they dare and when they dare. I felt that when I was talking to the embassy or to the Foreign Office, it was the civil servant end of politics that was most rule abiding. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
The people who worked on the side were not, and the people who worked on top were not either. And we as human rights groups were far out. We did what we wanted. This is why I stayed in that corner as long as I did, because that's where I felt comfortable, where I could say what I wanted. Because when I came back from America and then from England, I was in Germany for the first time as an adult, as really politically minded adult, where I had the passport and where I could say what I wanted to say, and they had to protect me. So I came back saying, now I'm going to say what I really feel and really think. And I did through the international activities, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's fascinating to hear. And this, so a lot of the topics that you've just spoken of were with regards to your work with PEN Germany. So we haven't yet talked about PEN International too much, have we? Or did you put the two together, as it were?
No, I didn't. When the job for German PEN was on the root level, on the basic level, because as I said, I had to do everything myself. In working for International PEN, I was the president of some 110 or more writers in prison committees worldwide, meaning we were all joined together at International PEN Writers in Prison Committee in London. I had direct contact, of course. I was in constant touch with the people who researched. We always had 4 or 5 researchers, and we had the director of the committee, Sarah Wyatt. And policies were made, general policies were made in London. We got the support from London, we got the information from London, and we filtered it back to London, whatever we had achieved. That was not work at the basis. I was all of a sudden representative of all writers in prison committees, meaning my name came up even if I only had signed a letter but hadn't really composed it. I was the front girl, so to speak.
Okay. So maybe in a future episode, then or the next episode, we can talk more in detail about this, the writers in prison side of things. How long were you there for? So heavily involved with writers in prison specifically.
Writers in prison. As a German pen, I started helping or adding to the German end of it. In the late 90s, I became Writers in Prison vice president in 2000, and I stayed until 2007. And I was president of International Pen Writers in Prison Committee from 2004 through to 2009.
Okay. All right. So this will probably be the next major installment then for our podcast. So I'll just make a note of that. So just for the curiosity, or to satisfy my curiosity, what's happening now in Myanmar, for example? So this seems like a classic case of a government which has been overthrown by its military, even though before there were some very distasteful episodes with regards to the Rohingya from the previous government. But anyway, it was a democratically elected government, or we are led to believe, even though the military had already 25% of the parliament according to their rules of election. So how would PEN then start to get involved? The government's been overthrown, the military's come to power, they're starting to clamp down on news agencies, social media. What's the process?
We were Writers in Prison was very much involved for almost decades to fight for San Suu Kyi. I think many of the people who worked for her and tried to back her with our few means were very disappointed when she didn't speak out against her own people when the persecution of the Rohingyas came. I met one of the persons she was in prison, I think, for 5.5 years. She was working with Aung San Suu Kyi. I met her in London, and I just realized that she has become a member of the board of German PEN. So there is direct information in German PEN, not in German PEN, sorry, International PEN. There is direct information through somebody who's been there, who knows every part of it, and who can filter that information into the Writers in Prison Committee and into International PEN on the highest level as well. So I'm sure that they're trying very hard in one way to help Aung San Suu Kyi, but also to pressure for different type of politics in the country. As I said, whether they succeed is another question. It's usually probably now a question of China and and Russia, and not of any Western country or influence from Western country, but maybe it helps. And whatever happens, we cannot stop trying to help, because we never know when we have the good luck that it really works.
Yeah, it's just such a tragedy that there are some countries where the people have suffered so much in the past, and they feel that they've turned not a page but a chapter, only for those pages to be turned back again or revisited upon them. And it's horrific. I can only imagine for the people involved.
Remember the country of your parents.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Armenia is not in a good situation right now.
No, absolutely not. And I guess in some ways the irony is that the Pashinyan, who sort of came to power on this wave of anti-corruption and so on, may perhaps have led to, of this young independent country's history, the worst 12 months in its history. And unfortunately, this is perhaps a sign that what Machiavellian politics suggests is you still do need a certain amount of corruption, but I'm not yet certain that that's necessarily the case. But it seems to be the case, at least in Armenia and in former Soviet republics, at least.
I hope it's not necessary. I hope we can keep it at a very, very low pace. I'm all for resisting, but we also have to resist in our own countries here, because in a minor way that is going on in many countries and in many societies, large and small. The corruption problem in China, for instance.
Yeah. Well,
where the high-ranking civil servants are put in jail one by one by now for corruption, and nobody knows whether it's for political reasons or for corruption, or because their superiors were corrupt and the whole lower echelon is going to be thrown into prison with them. Again, it is not a Chinese problem. It's a problem in all countries. Yes.
Yeah, it's a human issue, I think, because the things that you mentioned there, that you highlight, are also common practice in banking institutions. If you are promoted within a generation of vice presidents and one person does something wrong against the rules, the entire level is removed as a subsequent move to protect itself. So I mean, there are these mechanisms in place in our free market economies as well. Then we can also think about McCarthyism, when anybody who they wanted to get rid of politically, they just called them a communist, and that was enough to besmirch their name enough to remove them from sort of popular debates. So, as you say, these are problems which are relevant
learned by every society from predecessors. Think of torture.
Yeah.
There are no new methods in torture. The methods in torture were created long before classical times, and they kind of were inherited by every society that wanted to use it for power reasons. The methods are the same. The means might differ. Today we have chemical means and can do a lot more in terms of scientific endeavors in torture. But the basic torture is the same.
Yeah, but the human body is still the same. We still react to pain in the same ways. So
right.
Absolutely.
And that was a big problem in Iran. We had quite a number of our friends who came into exile and had been tortured badly.
Yeah, this was also a factor in the Iran-Iraq war, where those who had been taken prisoner were tortured to obviously get whatever information they could. And some of the reports on those techniques are quite horrific.
Yes.
So I mean, I won't go into any details, but you're right. And perhaps this
And this,
also.
I'm sorry,
Yes.
it's the same thing whether it's you torture people of a different country, of your enemy, and here they were torturing people of their own country, declaring them enemies. And that's also a method of creating enmity that has translated from early times till today.
Sure. And in truth, also, old countries such as Iran, which, I mean, it has a history of over 3,000 years, they've had time to perfect some of these methods, I guess. And the younger countries have essentially learned from them in many ways.
True. Because torture is not necessarily dependent on a system of country. It can be a system of society, of clan. It's not bound to the nationality business. So it is in new countries, it's in old countries, and I'm not quite sure whether the so-called new countries or new societies learned it from Iran or Iraq or whatever. It might have been in their own culture already.
Well, I mean, if we think, because new countries, obviously, we're talking about, relatively speaking, the USA, and I'm pretty sure that the Europeans picked up quite a few of their own torture methods over the years through medieval times, but also before then. And some of those were also picked up upon their trips in the Crusades. So these things are unfortunately passed on bit by bit through the ruling classes, as it were.
Well, to me, the new countries are the ones that became independent in the 60s, which is in Africa and Asia.
Okay, sure.
So I was thinking in newer terms, and you have problems in Asia, you have problems in all of Africa with torture, not in an organized way as you have it in. I'm sure Iraq has torture, Iran has torture. Many countries use it, particularly in prison. It's not new, it's not old, it's unfortunately everywhere. And I think the only thing we can do is stem against it. It's like the Sisyphus element. You have to roll up the heavy stone up the mountain, no matter how many times it rolls over your back to the valley.
Yeah. Unfortunately, nowadays there seem to be lots of stones, and the valleys get deeper and deeper. But I'd like to think that support is never too far, and it seems to be. We do seem to be entering one of those situations where we're turning a corner now. Whether that's because social media has actually begun to bear fruit, I don't know. I think that's far too optimistic a perspective to have. But when we look at the growing support for certain movements, such as Me Too, Black Lives Matter, these are movements with real power, real international influence, and hopefully on the basis of similar kinds of movements, we can also start to affect change in other areas, in other arenas. Um, Karin, I know that talking for such a long time is not easy, especially as most of our conversations are heavily burdensome upon you because you do most of the talking. So I understand that maybe this is probably a good time to take a break. But do you have any sort of final thoughts on what we've discussed?
No, I think we have a lot more thoughts next time.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Wonderful. Then, thank you very much again for your wonderful insight, and of course, informing us on some of these difficult chapters from your important work at Penn International, but also, of course, what began in Penn, Germany. Thank you very much, Karin.
Thank you very much.